If we start crystallizing, especially if there's data to back it. I mean, I've done some napkin math. I think there's probably like 150 to 300,000 defensive gun uses just in the state of Texas, just like my napkin math whenever I look at stuff.
Okay.
Um,
We are the Arms Attorneys. Today we are talking about a recent study on self-defense firearms uses that was widely maligned. We're going to talk to you about what the study was and what it concluded. And finally, we're going to talk about how the media and academia and the justice system all collude in order to suppress actual firearms data. But before we get started, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting the like button.
and this is, and I mean, I need some love in the comments on this because I listen to the New York Times podcast, so y'all don't have to. That alone.
I didn't know where that was going. I was like, okay, all right, yes, fair enough.
Oh man, if you can tell, it's just like a bunch of cat parents sitting in a tall building without sunshine, discussing, figuring out, when does the next trust payment land. It was brutal.
I'm sorry.
But, and that's really what started this conversation. We have Mr. William English. He is a researcher, a professor. From what I could tell, does mostly economic issues, but engaged in the largest survey of gun owners in the United States and pulled out some pretty helpful data that's in line with think about the Obama administration's Centers for Disease Control, kind of lines up with these kind of big trends that we see over and over. But for whatever reason, the New York Times, instead of attacking necessarily him's data, starts going after him.
Yes, him's data.
Him's data.
And yes,
I
so
mean, you,
no,
should I
I
redo
know I
that?
love that.
Okay,
Keep that.
okay.
Yes, so but I'll just take you back. Recall that the Obama administration concluded that there are somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million defensive firearm uses every year. That is the good guy with a gun stopping the crime, probably bad guy with gun. So Mr. William English did a survey. There were 54,000 gun owners surveyed, and extrapolating his data, he came up with something pretty square in the middle of that.
Yeah, it's about 1.5 million.
About 1.5 million. He thinks there are about 1.5 million instances of a good guy with a gun stopping a criminal act every single year, which again, that lines up with the Obama administration. And yet, the clear example that we see on a daily basis now of lefties losing it, we have this like uproar from states attorneys general, from academia itself, and drum roll, the New York Times. Who else except maybe the Washington Post, right?
Yeah.
Essentially going after not just the data and the methodology, but Mr. English, Dr. English, I would imagine, as a person.
Yeah, and why is this important? Well, this data makes its way into quite a few firearms cases across the United States. Maybe you've heard of this one, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin even.
Rahimi was cited. His amicus was cited in Rahimi by Alito.
Yeah, Alito, in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, it was in a concurrence. So, it has impacts. Obviously, it's persuasive to the court. Amicus is a friend of the court brief. Anybody can submit these things, and typically, it's really just like a tally mark. We got 10 people on this side, 10 amicus briefs on this side. Very rarely do we see a brief get brought up in kind of these majority opinions or concurring opinions. The exception with the Jack Smith case that's going on against Donald Trump. They're actually going to hold oral arguments on an amicus brief.
I did not know that.
Yeah, that just doesn't happen very often.
Does not happen very often.
And so, but we see this study from 2021, largest survey of gun owners ever conducted. If we start crystallizing, especially if there's data to back it. I mean, I've done some napkin math. I think there's probably like 150 to 300,000 defensive gun uses just in the state of Texas, just like my napkin math whenever I look at stuff.
Okay.
I look at the number of license holders, look at the people we interact with. I kind of extrapolate that those are the numbers I got. But, not scientist, there's not any really solid methodology there.
He just loves himself a spreadsheet.
I love myself a spreadsheet. I love myself some napkin math. But, it lines up. It rings true. But we see the New York Times doing, and we do not have enough contempt for the media.
No.
But
Ratchet that up, please.
they really did a disservice here, and I think some pretty dishonest reporting.
They did. Well, I mean, first of all, they attacked him as a human being and about how essentially because he has served as an expert witness, that he's completely unreliable. He's bought and paid for by pro-gun groups, which is rich coming from the New York Times, but okay. But then that's really not even the most dishonest part, because when they go after the methodology, they're just lying about what happened.
Yeah, and I would say so. Mr. English did a really good breakdown on the Wall Street Journal. He goes and he dissects every single complaint that the New York Times, proffers in their podcast. And that was one of the big criticisms. None of this stuff is peer reviewed. The questions were misleading. Well, turns out the way the questions are framed were peer reviewed. The data is publicly available. This was a survey, not just him, picking up the phone, calling people he knows, likes guns. He used a survey company who does all kinds of surveys, not just gun surveys.
Right.
So we have all these kind of different layers that lend to the methodology and the accuracy, and the results. And I think the New York Times kind of purposely buried their head in the sand. Would you believe that?
Well, I know. Well, and ultimately, William English doesn't say this explicitly, but I'll say it. Ultimately, the New York Times did this because when the attorneys general of several states were trying to subpoena all of this information and stop his research, and then once everything was produced and they said, okay, well, why did we do this? There's nothing here. The New York Times had to pick up that baton and find a way to shut him down because the justice system didn't work. And so, I mean, if you can't get convicted in the courts, you better convict him in the media. And that was, I mean, the attempt here, not just to discredit this particular information, but I think to discourage other academics in the future from producing data that supports firearms. I mean, what else is there?
Yeah, and I think this lends towards the trend of the weaponization of government. I mean, the media is kind of far ahead of them on this in this aspect. But part of this is, you throw the lawyers in jail, throw the academics in jail. If thou doth protest too much, and so I think this is just a good reminder. Hey, guess what? If you're doing the right thing, I mean, there's really no issues to all this, and we need good data because we see this public funded lobbying. We see the government trying to collect all this, maybe even misleading data. It's important that we have a balanced view of all of this.
Absolutely.
But check out these stories, and we hope you enjoy this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video.
And please question and comment for us below. Until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.